June 14, 1943, 3:22 p.m., RAF Farnborough, Hampshire. The German fighter's engine exploded without warning. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Kellerman felt the shockwave through the control column before he heard it, a deep, guttural detonation that sent vibrations rattling through his teeth. The captured Focke-Wulf 190A-3 lurched violently to port, black smoke pouring from the BMW 801 radial engine cowling. He had exactly 11 seconds before the oil temperature gauge buried itself in the red zone, and maybe 30 before the whole aircraft became a flaming coffin at 4,000 feet. Mayday, Mayday, Farnborough Tower, Test Bird 3 has catastrophic engine failure. The propeller seized, just stopped. One moment it was a spinning disc of death capable of chewing through steel. The next it was 3 frozen blades catching the airstream like barn door. The FW-190 pitched forward so violently that Kellerman's forehead slammed into the gun sight, splitting the skin above his left eyebrow. Blood ran into his eye, hot and copper-tasting where it reached his lips. He had 600 feet to figure out why the most feared fighter in the Luftwaffe had just tried to kill him, and this was the 3rd time it had happened. If you're the kind of person who needs to know why things work the way they do, why engineers make life or death decisions based on numbers most people can't even pronounce, then you're going to want to stick around for this story. Hit that like button, smash subscribe, because what happened in the skies over England in 1943 changed the course of air combat forever, and it all started with one captured aircraft that refused to behave. But to understand why Kellerman was plummeting toward a Hampshire field with blood in his eyes and a dead engine, we need to go back 3 months to the moment when everything began. March 8, 1943, 7:15 a.m., RAF Tangmere. The Focke-Wulf had arrived on a flatbed truck under armed guard, covered in canvas tarps that did nothing to hide its distinctive profile. Wing Commander Edward Morrison stood in the cold morning drizzle, watching a crew of engineers pull back the covers like surgeons preparing for a complicated operation. "Beautiful, isn't she?" said Captain James Rutherford, chief engineer of the Royal Aircraft Establishment's captured enemy aircraft flight. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly fogged in the damp English air. Forced landing 3 weeks ago near Dover. Pilot took shrapnel to the leg from a Spitfire, put her down in a field. Engine was still running when our boys got to him. Morrison walked around the aircraft slowly. The FW-190A-3 was compact, aggressive-looking, with a radial engine that gave it a blunt, predatory nose. Its wide-track landing gear and thick wings spoke of stability and power. The yellow paint on the nose had been hastily covered with RAF roundels, but you could still see the outline of German markings underneath. "How many of these have we brought down in the last 6 months?" Morrison asked. 214 confirmed kills, Rutherford said, consulting a clipboard. "Our loss ratio against them is bloody awful, nearly 2-to-1 in their favor. The Spitfire McPhee can't catch them in a dive, can't outturn them at low altitude, and they've got 4 cannon and 2 machine guns to our 8 machine guns. Every squadron commander from here to Scotland is screaming for answers." Morrison ran his hand along the engine cowling. The metal was cold, dotted with rain. So we test it, Rutherford agreed. "Find its weaknesses, figure out how to kill it." What neither man knew was that the weakness was already there, built into the very heart of the machine, invisible to the naked eye, a flaw so fundamental that it would eventually account for the deaths of hundreds of German pilots. But discovering it would nearly cost them everything. The first test flight was scheduled for March 12th. 4 days to prep the aircraft, check every system, make sure nothing had been damaged in the forced landing. Rutherford's team worked around the clock, stripping panels, examining fuel lines, testing control surfaces. The BMW 801D2 engine was a monster, a 14-cylinder, twin-row radial producing 1,700 horsepower at takeoff. It breathed through a massive cooling fan and used a complex fuel injection system that was leagues ahead of British carburetor technology. The Germans had also fitted it with something called the Kommando Gerät, an automatic engine control system that managed mixture, timing, and boost pressure all at once. "It's like having a second pilot just for the engine," Rutherford explained to Morrison on the night before the first flight. They stood in the hangar, the FW-190 surrounded by work lights that cast harsh shadows across its camouflage paint. "The pilot just has one lever, throttle. Everything else happens automatically. No mixture control, no propeller pitch control, no boost override. The Kommando Gerät does it all." "Sounds like magic," Morrison said. "German engineering," Rutherford corrected, which is the same thing until it isn't. The assigned test pilot was Flight Lieutenant David Harrison, a former instructor with 3,000 hours and the kind of steady hands that made him ideal for experimental work. He arrived at 190A-3 on March 12th, spent 2 hours in the cockpit, memorizing the German instrument panel, then climbed out looking thoughtful. "Visibility is outstanding," he reported. "Better than a Spitfire. The canopy gives you almost 360 degrees. Controls feel heavy, though. Ailerons are stiff. The manuals say you need to use rudder more than stick," Rutherford said. "German pilots train differently, more coordinated inputs." Harrison nodded. "Right then, let's see what she can do." At 9:47 a.m., the BMW 801 coughed to life with a roar that made the ground crew step back. The sound was different from a Merlin engine, deeper, more brutal, like a caged animal that had just remembered it. Blue smoke poured from the exhaust stubs, and the whole aircraft shook as Harrison ran up the engine. The takeoff was perfect. The FW-190 accelerated down the runway like it was late for an appointment, lifted off after just 400 yards, and clawed into the sky at an angle that would have stalled a Spitfire. Harrison's voice came through the radio, professionally calm. "Testbird 1 airborne, climbing to Angels 10, all systems normal." Morrison and Rutherford watched from the control tower as the fighter climbed in a wide spiral, its outline shrinking against the clouds. For 20 minutes, Harrison put it through basic maneuvers, gentle turns, climbs, descents, checking handling characteristics. Everything was textbook. Then he pushed it. "Going to full throttle," Harrison reported, testing maximum level speed. The FW-190 accelerated away from the airfield, disappearing to the southeast. Morrison could hear the engine note change over the radio, the pitch rising as Harrison poured on power. For 90 seconds, everything was fine. Then Harrison's voice came back, tight with confusion. "Tower, Testbird 1, I'm showing something's not right with the oil pressure. It's fluctuating, dropping and spiking." Rutherford grabbed the microphone. "Harrison, reduce throttle to cruise power. Confirm oil temperature." A pause. "Oil temp is climbing. 115 degrees, 120. Throttle's back to 70%, but the temperature's still rising." "Abort the test," Morrison said. "Get him back here." Rutherford was already talking. "Harrison, return to base immediately. Land as soon as you're in the pattern. We'll have the fire truck standing by." "Understood. Turning back now. Temperature's at 130. That's not normal, is it?" "No," Rutherford said quietly. "It's not." Harrison made it back and landed without incident, but when the engineers pulled the cowling, they found oil splattered across the entire engine compartment. One of the cylinder head gaskets had blown, probably from overpressure. It took 3 days to source a replacement from captured German stocks and install it properly. The second test flight was on March 18th. Different pilot, Flight Lieutenant Thomas Kellerman, the same man who would later find himself falling from the sky with blood in his eyes. Kellerman was younger than Harrison, 26 years old, with a reputation for being able to feel what an aircraft was trying to tell him through the controls. This time, they were cautious. Kellerman kept the power settings conservative, never pushing past 80% throttle. He flew for 40 minutes, testing handling, taking the FW-190 through aerobatic maneuvers, loops, rolls, split S turns. The aircraft performed flawlessly, responding with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "She's incredible," Kellerman reported, genuine admiration in his voice. "The roll rate is twice what I get in a Spitfire. The visibility is outstanding. I can see why our boys are having trouble with these." But at minute 42, the oil pressure dropped again. Not dramatically, just a 10% decrease that held steady, but enough to make Rutherford nervous. "Kellerman, bring her home. Don't push it. Already on the way." Another successful landing, another blown gasket, different cylinder this time. Morrison and Rutherford stood in the hangar that night, staring at the disassembled engine. The cylinder heads were arranged on a workbench like organs removed during an autopsy. "It's not the gaskets," Rutherford said. "These are the correct German parts, installed to German specifications. The problem is something else." "Fuel quality," Morrison suggested. "Possible. The Germans use different octane ratings, but we're running it on 95 octane, which should be equivalent to their B4 fuel. The commander rate should compensate, unless it can't." Rutherford picked up one of the cylinder heads, turning it in the harsh worklight. "There's carbon buildup here. See? On the valve seats. More than there should be after just 2 test flights. Meaning it's running rich. Too much fuel, not enough air. The automatic control system is dumping extra fuel into the cylinders, probably to cool them, but it's creating carbon deposits and increasing cylinder pressure beyond what the gaskets can handle." Morrison pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lit one, and exhaled slowly. "So what you're telling me is that the most advanced fighter engine in the world has a design flaw that makes it destroy itself." "Not exactly." Rutherford set down the cylinder head and removed his glasses, cleaning them with a handkerchief. "The Germans have been flying these for 2 years without this problem, which means we're doing something different. The question is, what? That question would take another 6 weeks to answer." 6 weeks of methodical testing, careful documentation, and increasingly dangerous flights. But the answer, when it finally came, would be so simple and so devastating that it would change air combat doctrine for the rest of the war. April 23, 1943, 2:15 p.m. Kellerman was back in the cockpit for the 9th test flight. By now, he knew the FW-190 better than any aircraft he'd ever flown. He'd memorized every instrument, every control response, every quirk of the German engineering. The maintenance crews had replaced the engine twice and rebuilt it completely once. They'd tried different fuel mixtures, different oil weights, different throttle techniques. Nothing stopped the overheating problem. But Rutherford had a new theory. "Don't climb above 8,000 feet, he told Kellerman during the pre-flight briefing. "Keep it low. I want you to do all your high-speed runs below 5,000. Any particular reason?" "Testing a hypothesis about air density," Rutherford said. "The BMW 801 uses a single-stage, single-speed supercharger. Above a certain altitude, the supercharger has to work harder to compress the thinner air. That creates heat and pressure. If I'm right, keeping you low should reduce the thermal stress." Kellerman nodded. "Worth a shot." The flight started well. Kellerman held the FW-190 at 4,000 feet, running it through speed trials over the Sussex countryside. The aircraft handled beautifully, the engine purring with Teutonic precision. Oil pressure stayed solid. Temperature climbed but remained within acceptable limits. Then Kellerman decided to try something. "Tower, Testbird 3, requesting permission to do a combat climb. Full throttle, maximum rate of ascent from 4,000 to 10,000 feet. I want to see what this thing can really do." Rutherford's voice came back immediately. "Negative, Kellerman. Stay below 8,000 as briefed. Just one climb. 30 seconds. I'll abort if anything looks wrong." A long pause. Morrison's voice. "Permission granted. But the first sign of trouble, you cut power and dive. Understood?" "Understood." Kellerman pushed the throttle forward to the stop. The BMW 801 responded with a bellow of power that pressed him back into his seat. The FW-190's nose came up, and the altimeter started unwinding. 5,000 feet, 6,000, 7,000. The climb rate was staggering, over 4,000 feet per minute. A Spitfire couldn't touch this performance. 8,000 feet. The oil temperature was rising, but still within limits. The engine sounded perfect, a mechanical symphony of pistons and valves operating in precise harmony. 9,000 feet. That's when the cylinder head temperature gauge spiked into the red zone. "Tower, I'm seeing..." The engine detonated. It wasn't a Hollywood explosion with fire and debris. It was worse. One of the cylinders suffered catastrophic detonation, the fuel-air mixture exploding too early, before the piston reached top dead center. The shockwave traveled through the engine block, cracking 2 more cylinder heads, rupturing oil lines, and causing the entire power plant to vibrate like it was trying to shake itself apart. The propeller was still turning, but the engine was dying. Oil pressure dropped to 0 in 4 seconds. Kellerman had maybe 20 seconds before complete seizure. He hauled back the throttle and pushed the nose down, trading altitude for glide distance. The FW-190 was heavy, designed for high-speed combat, not gliding. It fell like a streamlined brick, the dead engine creating drag that fought every foot of forward motion. "Mayday, mayday, Farnborough Tower! Testbird 3 has catastrophic engine failure. That's when the propeller seized, and that's where we came in. With Kellerman bleeding from his forehead, 600 feet of altitude left, and a fighter that had suddenly become a very expensive lawn dart. But here's what Kellerman had that the German pilots wouldn't: training for exactly this scenario. British test pilots spent hundreds of hours practicing forced landings because experimental aircraft failed constantly. Kellerman had put down dead-stick aircraft 23 times in his career. Never in a German fighter, never with blood running into his eyes, but the principles were the same. Find a field, set up the approach, don't stall, don't spin, touch down with the landing gear up if you have to. He spotted a pasture 3 miles southeast, maybe 40 acres of relatively flat ground, with a few sheep scattered across it. Not ideal. There was a stone wall at the far end. But it would have to do. The FW-190 was dropping at 1,200 feet per minute. Kellerman had 30 seconds to set up the approach. He lowered the landing gear. The hydraulic system was still working, thank God, and extended the flaps to the first notch. That would bleed off excess speed and give him more control at touchdown. The sheep saw him coming and scattered, white dots fleeing across green grass. Kellerman aimed for the center of the field, his right hand tight on the control stick, his left on the throttle that controlled nothing anymore. The FW-190's glide characteristics were actually better than he expected. The thick wings provided decent lift, even without power. The ground rushed up. Kellerman could see individual blades of grass now, could see the ruts in the field where a farmer's plow had cut parallel lines. He held the nose up, bleeding off speed, letting the main gear touch first. The wheels hit with a jolt that rattled his spine. The FW-190 bounced once, came down again, and started rolling across the pasture. Kellerman stood on the brakes, feeling them grab, the tail coming up as momentum fought physics. 60 yards from the stone wall, the fighter stopped. Kellerman sat in the cockpit for 10 seconds, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the hammer of his own heartbeat. His hands were shaking. Blood dripped from his eyebrow onto the instrument panel, spattering across the German lettering. Then he unbuckled, popped the canopy, and climbed out onto the wing. The sheep had gathered at the far end of the field, watching him with that peculiar mixture of curiosity and indifference that only sheep can manage. "Bloody German engineering," Kellerman muttered, and started walking toward the road. The post-flight analysis took 3 days. Engineers transported the wrecked FW-190 back to Farnborough, stripped the engine down to individual components, and examined everything under microscopes and calipers. What they found would eventually lead to the deaths of hundreds of German pilots, but at the time, it just seemed like a simple mechanical failure. Rutherford gathered the team in the analysis room on April 26th. The disassembled engine was spread across 3 tables, every part tagged and cataloged. Morrison was there, along with 6 other engineers and Kellerman, who sported 12 stitches above his left eyebrow and a purple bruise that covered half his forehead. "Gentlemen," Rutherford began, "we have our answer, and it's both simpler and more complicated than we thought." He picked up a cylinder head, pointing to the combustion chamber. The BMW 801 was designed to operate on German B4 fuel, which has an octane rating of approximately 95. We've been running it on British 95 octane, which should be equivalent, but there's a critical difference. He paused for effect. Every man in the room leaned forward. German fuel uses a different blend of additives, specifically different anti-knock compounds. The Commandogerit automatic control system is calibrated for those specific chemical properties. When you substitute British fuel, the combustion characteristics change slightly. Not enough to notice at low power settings, but at high power, particularly at altitude, the fuel burns differently. Morrison frowned. Burns how? Faster, hotter. The flame front propagates through the cylinder more rapidly, creating pressure spikes that the German fuel would suppress. The Commandogerit detects this as potential detonation and compensates by enriching the mixture, dumping in more fuel to cool the cylinders. But our fuel doesn't have the same cooling properties as theirs, so the extra fuel just creates more heat and more carbon buildup. "A cascade failure," one of the engineers said. "Exactly. The system tries to fix the problem and makes it worse. Eventually, you get actual detonation, uncontrolled explosion in the cylinders instead of smooth combustion. That's what destroyed the engine at 9,000 feet. Kellerman spoke up. "So the aircraft works perfectly in German hands, but in ours, it tears itself apart." "Essentially, yes. The Germans have been flying these things at high altitude over France and Germany without issues because they're using the correct fuel. But we can't replicate their fuel chemistry without their exact formulas and refineries." Morrison pulled out his cigarettes, lit one, and stared at the engine components. "This is interesting from a testing standpoint, but I fail to see how it helps us shoot down FW-190s. The Luftwaffe isn't using British fuel." Rutherford smiled. It was the kind of smile that predators wear when they've spotted something small and vulnerable. "No," he said, "they're not. But what if they were forced to?" May 3rd, 1943, 10:30 a.m., RAF High Wycombe. Morrison presented his findings to a room full of senior officers who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. The war was grinding through its 3rd year, and the Luftwaffe was still winning more often than not. Anything that could tip the balance was worth considering. "The fundamental weakness," Morrison explained, pointing to a diagram of the BMW 801 engine, "is fuel sensitivity. The FW-190's automatic control system is brilliantly designed but inflexible. It expects a very specific type of fuel. Deviate from that specification, and the system becomes unstable." A group captain in the back row raised his hand. "So we poison their fuel supplies?" "Not poison, contaminate. Sabotage teams have already been targeting German fuel depots in France and the Low Country. Currently, they're using demolition charges, which destroys the fuel entirely. Effective, but temporary. The Germans just ship in more fuel and resume operations." "What are you suggesting?" "Chemical contamination. Small amounts of additives introduced into German fuel stocks. Compounds that would change the combustion characteristics just enough to trigger the cascade failure we observed. The German pilots wouldn't know anything was wrong until they climbed to altitude and pushed their engines to combat power. Then," he snapped his fingers. The sound echoed in the silent room. "The engines would tear themselves apart. No external damage, no warning signs during pre-flight inspection, just catastrophic failure at the worst possible moment. In combat." Another officer, older, with more ribbons on his chest, "How much contamination would we need?" Our chemists estimate less than 2% by volume. A single agent could contaminate enough fuel to affect dozens of aircraft with just a few pounds of the right compound smuggled into a fuel depot. And you're certain this would work? Morrison gestured to Kellerman, standing against the back wall. Flight Lieutenant Kellerman experienced it firsthand. We've now replicated the failure 8 times out of 9 test flights using contaminated fuel. The one flight that didn't fail stayed below 5,000 feet and never exceeded 60% throttle, essentially useless for combat. The room erupted in quiet conversation. Officers leaned together, whispering, calculating. Morrison could see the wheels turning. This wasn't just about destroying a few aircraft. This was about psychological warfare. German pilots were already pushing their machines to the limit in combat if they couldn't trust their engines. But what Morrison didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the plan was already in motion. Intelligence services don't wait for committee approval when they see an opportunity. By the time Morrison was presenting his findings, 3 teams of saboteurs were already on their way to occupied France with small vials of chemical compounds carefully selected to destroy BMW 801 engines from the inside. June 8, 1943, 11:45 p.m., northern France. Lieutenant Sarah Blackwood had never seen a fuel depot before, but she knew explosives and she knew chemistry. The French resistance had supplied her team with detailed layouts of the German fuel storage facility outside Abbeville, 6 massive tanks holding nearly 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel, enough to keep an entire fighter wing operational for weeks. The facility was guarded, but not heavily. The Germans didn't expect sabotage this far behind the lines, and most of their combat forces were deployed forward. 4 guards, 2 dogs, a fence with a single gate. Blackwood's team consisted of herself, 2 demolition experts borrowed from the Special Operations Executive, and a resistance fighter named Marcel, who knew every back road within 50 miles. They approached from the east, moving through a wheat field that whispered in the night breeze. The moon was a sliver, which made navigation difficult, but concealment easier. Blackwood carried a small satchel containing 12 glass vials, each holding 50 milliliters of a compound that the chemists at Farnborough had designated Agent K-17. "The fence is there," Marcel whispered, pointing. "Guard changes in 15 minutes. When they move to the gate, you'll have 3 minutes. Maybe 4. Blackwood nodded. She'd memorized the plan a dozen times, run through it with clay models and maps until she could do it in her sleep. Cut through the fence. Reach fuel tank number 3. Climb the access ladder. Pour the vials into the filling port. Get out. 12 minutes, start to finish." The guard change happened on schedule. 2 Germans walked toward the gate, rifles slung over their shoulders, talking about something in voices that carried across the still air. Blackwood's demolition expert cut through the fence with wire cutters that made almost no sound, just small clicks of metal separating. She was through the fence and running low across open ground. The fuel tanks loomed like sleeping giants, their curved sides reflecting starlight. Tank 3 was the farthest, naturally, which meant maximum exposure time. Her boots crunched on gravel, and she froze, certain the sound would bring guards running. Nothing. Just wind and the distant murmur of German voices. The access ladder was cold under her hands. She climbed quickly, the satchel bouncing against her hip. At the top, she found the filling port exactly where the resistance intelligence had said it would be. A circular hatch secured with a simple clasp. She opened it. The smell of aviation fuel hit her immediately, sharp and chemical, making her eyes water. Inside the tank, somewhere far below, was enough fuel to keep 24 Focke-Wulfs in the air, and she was about to ruin all of it. The vials came out of the satchel one by one. She poured them carefully into the port, watching the clear liquid disappear into the darkness below. Agent K-17 was designed to be miscible with aviation fuel. It would mix thoroughly, spread throughout the tank, and render the entire contents chemically compromised, not destroyed, just wrong. The 11th vial. Voices, closer now. German voices, urgent. The 12th vial slipped from her fingers, hit the metal rim of the port, and shattered. Glass and chemicals splashed across her hand, burning cold for just an instant before she wiped it off. No time to think about it. She closed the port, scrambled down the ladder, and ran. The fence seemed a mile away. Her lungs burned. Behind her, shouts in German, the sound of boots on gravel. A dog barked, high and frantic. Marcel was at the fence, holding it open. She dove through, rolled, came up running. The wheat field swallowed them, and they were gone into the French night. June 11th, 1943, 9:20 a.m., Abbeville Airfield. Hauptmann Klaus Richter performed his pre-flight inspection with the same meticulous care he brought to every mission. The Focke-Wulfs 190A-3 was his third aircraft of the war. The first two had been shot down. Though he'd walked away from both crashes, he'd learned not to take anything. The engine cowling was warm to the touch. It was normal. The ground crew had already run it up to operating. Fuel load was full. Ammunition bays loaded with 400 rounds for the cannon and 900 for the machine guns. Oil level was good. Tires properly inflated. "Everything looks excellent, Herr Hauptmann," his crew chief said. A young kid from Bavaria, couldn't have been more than 19, with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. "It better be," Richter said, but he smiled. The Tommies aren't getting any easier to kill. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Escort a formation of bombers hitting targets near Portsmouth, maintain altitude between 8 and 12,000 meters, engage any British fighters that attempted interception. Standard work. Richter had flown this mission, or variations of it, 43 times. He climbed into the cockpit, settled into the seat that had been molded to his body by hours of flight. The parachute pack dug into his spine the way it always did. He connected the oxygen mask, the radio lead, and ran through the startup checklist. Battery on, fuel pump on, magnetos armed. The starter motor whined, the propeller turned, and the BMW 801 caught with a roar that made the aircraft shudder. Richter watched the gauges climb toward normal operating ranges. Oil pressure, cylinder head temperature, fuel flow, everything looked perfect. At 9:47 a.m., his flight of 4 FW-190s took off into a sky that was, for once, mostly clear. They formed up at 2,000 meters, joined the bomber formation at 4,000, and turned northwest toward England. Richter loved flying the FW-190. It was the first fighter he'd flown that felt like it was built for combat rather than adapted to it. The cockpit visibility was outstanding. He could see nearly straight down past his boots. The controls were heavy but precise, and the 4 cannon gave him killing power that a Spitfire couldn't match. They crossed the French coast at 10:15 a.m. The English Channel was a gray sheet below them, dotted with whitecaps. Richter climbed to 8,000 meters, the altitude where the BMW 801 supercharger operated most efficiently. The oil pressure gauge flickered, just once, just a tiny dip, maybe 5%, then back to normal. Richter frowned. Could be a faulty gauge, could be nothing. He kept climbing. At 8,500 meters, the gauge flickered again. This time it dropped 10% and took 3 seconds to recover. The cylinder head temperature was also climbing, creeping into the yellow zone. "Red leader, this is Red 3, came a voice over the radio. "I'm showing unusual engine readings. Oil pressure unstable." Richter glanced left. Red 3 was Heinrich, his wingman, flying formation 50 meters away. His aircraft looked normal, no smoke or obvious problems. "Confirmed," Richter said. "I'm seeing the same. All flights, check your engine instruments." One by one, the acknowledgements came back. 7 out of 12 aircraft were experiencing the same symptoms: fluctuating oil pressure, rising temperatures. Not critical yet, but concerning. The bomber formation leader's voice. "Fighter escort, this is Victor Leader. We're 10 minutes from target. Can you maintain position?" Richter looked at his gauges. The temperature was at the top of the yellow zone, threatening to cross into red. But they were committed. The bombers needed protection, and turning back now would leave them vulnerable. "Affirmative, Victor Leader. We'll stay with you." That decision would cost him everything. The British fighters came out of the sun at 10:34 a.m., 8 Spitfire MiG-9s, from a squadron based near Southampton. They'd been vectored to the bomber formation by ground radar and had climbed to 13,000 meters to get above the German fighters. Richter saw them at the last second, bright flashes of reflected sunlight as they rolled into their attack dive. "Achtung! Spitfires! High and diving! All flights break and engage!" He hauled the FW-190 into a climbing turn, feeding in rudder to keep the nose up, pulling the throttle to maximum power. The BMW 801 responded with a surge of acceleration that pressed him into his seat. For 10 seconds, it was perfect. The FW-190 climbed like nothing the British could match, the 4 cannon ready to tear into any Spitfire that crossed his sights. Richter picked out a target, a Spitfire trying to cut inside his turn, and started to roll toward it. Then his engine exploded. The detonation happened in cylinder number 7, where the contaminated fuel had been burning just slightly wrong for the past 20 minutes, building up carbon deposits and pressure until something finally gave. The explosion cracked the cylinder head, sent shrapnel through 2 more cylinders, and ruptured the main oil line. Oil pressure went to 0 in less than 2 seconds. Richter didn't understand what had happened. One moment he was in a combat climb with full power, the next his engine was shaking itself to pieces, and smoke was pouring into the cockpit. The control panel lit up like a Christmas tree. Oil pressure warning, temperature warning, fire warning. He cut the throttle and pulled the mixture to cutoff, killing the fuel flow. The The propeller continued to windmill, but the engine was dead. No power, no thrust, just a dead weight hanging off the front of his aircraft. "Red leader is hit," he called over the radio. "Engine failure, He didn't finish the transmission because at that moment, Heinrich's FW-190, Red 3, blew up. Not the engine, the whole aircraft. It happened so fast that Richter almost missed it. 1 second Heinrich was there, 50 meters to the left, his aircraft trailing smoke from an engine failure identical to Richter's. The next second, a Spitfire put a 3-second burst into him, and Heinrich's fighter disintegrated in a fireball that consumed everything: wings, fuselage, pilot, leaving nothing but burning debris tumbling toward the channel. Richter pushed the nose down, trading altitude for glide distance. Behind him, more explosion, more German voices screaming over the radio. The contaminated fuel was doing its work, and every FW-190 that pushed to combat power was suffering catastrophic engine failure at the worst possible moment. 7 German fighters had taken off from Abbeville that morning. 3 would make it back to France. The rest would fall into the English Channel or crash land in fields across southern England, their engines destroyed by fuel that looked perfect but burned all wrong. Richter made it 12 miles before the altitude ran out. He bailed out at 500 meters, felt the opening shock of the parachute, and floated down into cold channel water where a British patrol boat picked him up 40 minutes later. June 14, 1943, 3:22 p.m., RAF Farnborough. Kellerman stood next to Morrison and Rutherford on the tarmac, watching as crews pulled the recovered German fighter off a transport truck. This one had been fished out of the channel after its pilot bailed out. The engine was full of seawater now, but the fuel samples taken from its tanks before recovery told the whole story. "Agent K-17, Rutherford said, examining a test tube filled with clear liquid. "Just like we put in tank number 3 at Abbeville, the contamination spread through their entire fuel supply system." Morrison was reading a preliminary report from intelligence. Estimates are that 40% of their fuel stocks in northern France are now compromised. They haven't figured out what's wrong yet. They think it's bad fuel from the refinery. They're running tests, grounding aircraft, draining tanks. "How many losses?" Kellerman asked. 17 confirmed kills in the first 3 days. All FW-190s, all due to engine failure at altitude. Our pilots are calling them mechanical kills. Kellerman walked around the recovered aircraft, his hands in his pockets. The FW-190 looked perfect from the outside. Just some scratches from the water landing, nothing that suggested catastrophic failure. But inside that beautiful BMW 801 engine, the damage would be total. Cracked cylinders, destroyed bearings, pistons welded to cylinder walls by uncontrolled detonation. "We're monsters," he said quietly. Morrison looked at him sharply. "We're winning. Same thing, isn't it?" "No. Winning means our pilots come home. Winning means the bombers get through. Winning means the war ends faster and fewer people die." Kellerman didn't argue. He just stood there, looking at the German fighter that had been brought down by chemistry rather than combat. The knowledge that this would be repeated hundreds of times over the coming months sat in his stomach like lead. But Morrison was right. The intelligence reports that would come in over the next 6 months would tell a brutal story. 340 Focke-Wulfs 190s lost to engine failures, the vast majority at high altitude during combat. The Luftwaffe would eventually trace the problem to fuel contamination and implement new security measures at their depots. They'd flush their entire fuel supply system in France, losing millions of gallons of aviation fuel in the process. By then, the air war had shifted. The Spitfire Mach-9 and the American P-51 Mustang were arriving in numbers. The tide was turning, and it had all started with one captured aircraft that refused to behave. September 3, 1943, 6:15 p.m., London. Sarah Blackwood sat in a debriefing room in a building that officially didn't exist, talking to men whose names she would never know. Her hand still bore a small scar where the Agent K-17 had splashed during that night mission back in June. The medics had assured her it was harmless, just a chemical burn that had healed clean. 3 more successful contamination operations, one of the men said, sliding a folder across the table. Cologne, Stuttgart, and Vienna. Total fuel compromise, approximately 600,000 gallons. Estimated aircraft affected, over 200. Good, it was the only word that seemed appropriate. We're expanding the program. New targets in Poland and Czechoslovakia. The Germans are moving their fuel production east to avoid bombing raids. We need agents who can operate in those territories. Blackwood nodded. She'd already accepted that this was her life now. Sneaking through occupied Europe with vials of chemicals, poisoning fuel supplies, killing men she would never see. It was cleaner than shooting them, she supposed, less personal. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she thought about the German pilots. Young men, most of them, probably no different from the RAF pilots she'd known before the war. They'd climb into their aircraft, run through their pre-flight checks, take off into hostile skies, and then, at the moment when they needed their engines most, everything. Some would bail out, some would glide to emergency landing, some would simply fall from the sky in burning. 340 confirmed, the nameless man was saying. That's the current estimate. 340 Focke-Wulfs 190s brought down by fuel contamination. The intelligence suggests the Luftwaffe is beginning to suspect sabotage, but they haven't been able to stop it. Every security measure they implement, we find a way around. Blackwood stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. Do we have a count of the pilots who died? The man looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. We don't keep those records. Does it matter? I don't know, she said. I honestly don't know. April 15th, 1944. Somewhere over Germany. The war was winding down, though nobody knew it yet. The contamination program had ended 3 months earlier when the Germans finally implemented foolproof security at their fuel depots and completely rebuilt their distribution network. It had cost them time, resources, and hundreds of aircraft. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, but it was bleeding out, losing pilots and machines faster than they could be replaced. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Kellerman was flying a Spitfire Make-9 over Germany, escorting bombers to targets in the industrial heartland. He'd survived the war so far through a combination of skill and luck, and he'd learned not to count on either one too heavily. Below him, a formation of German fighters rose to intercept. They were FW-190s, the same aircraft he'd tested back in 1943. He could recognize the silhouette even from 3,000 feet up. The combat that followed was brief and brutal. Kellerman's squadron had altitude advantage and better aircraft. They dove through the German formation, guns chattering, and Kellerman put a burst into an FW-190 that was trying to climb away. He saw his tracer rounds walk across the fuselage, saw pieces breaking off, saw smoke starting to pour from the engine. The German fighter rolled over and went down, trailing fire. Kellerman didn't follow it. There was no point. The pilot was either dead or would be soon. He reformed with his squadron and continued the escort mission. Another kill marked on his aircraft's scorecard. But that night, back at base, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Had that FW-190's engine failed on its own? Or had it been his bullets? Had the German pilot been fighting a mechanical problem when Kellerman killed him? Would he have survived if his engine had been running properly? There was no way to know. The war didn't care about those kinds of questions. November 23, 1947, RAF Farnborough. The war had been over for 2 years. Kellerman was a civilian now, working as a test pilot for commercial aircraft manufacturers. He rarely thought about the war, rarely talked about it. Most people didn't want to hear the real stories anyway. They wanted heroes and villains, clear narratives, simple truths. But when Morrison called and asked him to come to Farnborough for a reunion of the old captured aircraft testing team, Kellerman agreed. Some bonds don't break, no matter how much time passes. They met in the same hangar where they'd tested the FW-190, though the aircraft was long gone now. Most of the German planes had been scrapped after the war, their secrets extracted and their usefulness exhausted. The hangar felt empty, echoing. Rutherford was there, looking older and thinner. Morrison had gained weight and lost hair. There were others, engineers, pilots, intelligence officers, all of them carrying the same weight of knowing what they'd done. Morrison raised a glass. To 340 victories, to the engine that couldn't breathe, to winning the war. They drank. The whiskey was good, probably better than they deserved. Later, standing outside in the cold November air, Kellerman asked the question he'd been avoiding for 4 years. Do you ever think about them? The German pilots? Morrison was quiet for a long time. Every day, he finally said. But I think about our pilots more. The ones who came home because the Germans' engines failed at the wrong moment. The ones who survived because we were willing to do whatever it took to win. Does that make it right? I don't know. But it makes it necessary. And maybe that's all we can ask for in wartime. Kellerman nodded. He didn't agree, but he understood. The moral calculus of war was written in blood and necessity, and there were no clean answers. They stood together in silence, two men who had helped kill hundreds of others through nothing more than chemistry and captured aircraft testing, watching the sunset over an England that was finally at peace. The BMW 801 engine had been a masterpiece of engineering, a triumph of German technical achievement, and they had found its one weakness, not through superior design or better technology, but through accident, testing, and the desperate need to find any advantage in a war that was killing millions. 340 Focke-Wulfs 190s had fallen from the sky because their engines couldn't breathe the fuel they were given. 340 pilots had learned too late that their most advanced weapon had a fatal flaw, and the men who discovered that flaw would carry it with them for the rest of their lives, a weight that no amount of victory could ever fully lift. The war was over. The killing had stopped, but the questions remained. unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, echoing in the empty spaces where certainty used to be. Somewhere in the archives at Farnborough, there was a technical report documenting the fuel contamination program. It was classified, sealed, forbidden. Kellerman had never read it and never would. Some knowledge was better left buried. He walked to his car, started the engine, a simple petrol engine that ran without mystery or malfunction, and drove home through the English countryside, past fields where sheep grazed peacefully, past the pasture where he'd once crashed a German fighter, and walked away with nothing more than stitches and a story he'd never tell. The past was behind him. The future was uncertain. And the present was just the moment between one breath and the next, each one a small miracle of combustion, compression, and the simple act of air flowing where it was supposed to go. The engine that couldn't breathe had taught them all something about the nature of war, about the invisible ways that conflicts are won and lost, about the price of victory measured in machines that failed and men who fell. And now, in the quiet aftermath, all they could do was remember and try to learn, and hope that the lessons might somehow make the next war a little less brutal, a little less necessary, a little more human. But history suggested otherwise.